All right, we're back. I wanted to talk to you a little bit. I mean, even though we were talking a little bit about how, because they have to be policy generalists in the Senate, that gender is sometimes neutralized. But you point out a number of cases, and you kind of mentioned it. We were talking about contraception, for example, which is a good example of when male policymakers who may be taking a stance that's seen as anti-women or they're being beat up by women's groups for taking a position, trot out a member of their own party. This especially happens, I think, amongst Republicans, but it does happen with Democrats as well. They trot out a woman senator and say, well, she agrees with us, and I wonder, do you think that, that the male-dominated leadership in either party or both parties sort of uses women as pawns or ornaments in any way?
Well, women's rights has increasingly become partisan and polarized. So women's rights, women's groups, these are democratic groups, democratic issues, very much in the minds of policy leadership and increasingly in the public. And you saw that in 2012 with the War on Women theme as part of the 2012 presidential election campaign. So that gives Democratic women a certain amount of increased power because they are in the party that is open to these issues. These are their own policy priorities. They can pursue their own policy priorities and score political points against Republicans and raise money for Democrats. And it's sort of a win-win for them whenever these things come up.
Well, there certainly are more Democratic women who are elected in both houses of the Congress.
And there are, the gap is much bigger than the gap is in the voting public. So the average gender gap in the voting public, we're talking about 7 points. If I look at women in the Senate, there are 16 Democratic women, there are 4 Republican women. So it is a much larger gap.
Right.
The Democratic women they call Barbara Mikulski the Dean of the Women.
Right.
And very often Harry Reid will go to Barbara Mikulski as the Dean of the Women. He will ask her to do something that will draw attention to women. Or the women themselves will get the idea, organize it, and go to Harry Reid. So when they're trying to pass Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, Barbara Mikulski says, what we should really do is go down to the floor dressed in red and make these speeches. And she's always talking about squaring the shoulders and putting on the lipstick and going out and fighting the fight. So for Democrats, women's rights issues bring them power. For Republicans, only abortion is probably the only women's issue that the Republican Party really focuses on. And otherwise, these are not core Republican issues. It's not national security and lower taxes and these kinds of things. So for Republican women, they need to make an argument as to how they can frame Republican issues to appeal to women. And you saw Kathy McMorris Rodgers become the House Conference chair partially on that argument. In the Senate, the Republican women don't have a lot of core power within the caucus because there's only 4 of them. So they can't really band together as a group, and they have very disparate ideologies, the 4 that are there. So Collins and Murkowski kind of on the moderate end, and Ayotte a little more conservative, and then Deb Fisher even more conservative than that, probably. So,
although she's still an unknown, I feel like, in terms of some of these issues as they come up. I'll be actually watching Deb Fisher from Nebraska because she actually was not the most conservative candidate in that race, and she kind of won because of the fight between the 2 most conservative guys. She won the primary mainly because of the fight between the 2 conservative guys, although certainly she's a Republican from Nebraska. There's no doubt she's conservative.
She got the Sarah Palin
I don't want to ruin her
endorsement.
Reputation on C-SPAN.
That's right. She got the Sarah Palin endorsement, and that carries a lot of weight in conservative circles. But so the Republican women, they are in this position where those issues aren't their core issues. They may not even want to focus on them. If I look at Kelly Ayotte, I think what she wants to focus on is foreign policy and military issues, and she gets drawn in sometimes on these other things. She's having a very hard time on gun control. She wishes that would go away.
Oh, for sure.
The discussion of that vote. So with the Republican women, what I saw happening was they would be making these choices about how to navigate. Do they want to deal with the issue or not? If they do deal with the issue, the party would very much like them to be the spokesperson. But if they do that, they're drawing attention to themselves on an issue they might not want to, and the press might portray them as women acting against women, and they don't want that. So you see actually over and over kind of the same type of story playing out. So with Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, the story that played out in the press was, wow, look, all the Republican women voted for the Lilly Ledbetter bill, and the Republican men, except for Arlen Specter, did not. But it was really more complicated behind the scenes.
It was much more complicated.
Republicans knew that Mike Enzi, their Help Committee, ranking member, could not be the one to offer the legislation. They needed a woman to offer the Republican alternative. They thought about going to Murkowski, but she was going to have a tough re-election fight, and she didn't want to get involved. They
Plus,
thought
there's
about
bad
Collins.
blood with her having gotten kicked out of leadership and whatnot.
That's
I think she's not willing to help them nearly as
well,
much as she used to be.
That's right. This was even before all of that.
Right.
And then they went to Hutchison, who is the loyal soldier, and this wouldn't hurt with her trying to run for governor of Texas to prove how conservative she is.
Right.
But the Republican women said, okay, we're going to support this, but when this goes down, we're going to vote for the Democratic bill because we don't want to be seen as women not supporting women. So except for Olympia Snowe, who only voted for the Democratic bill, the rest of them voted for the amendment. Murkowski co-sponsored the amendment.
Right.
That was the Republican alternative, and then went the other way. The same thing just happened on the Violence Against Women Act.
That's right.
Right? You had sort of the same dynamic going on. Deb Fisher voted against it, but the rest of the Republican women voted for it and weren't supporting the Republican alternative.
Do you think that's because, that they end up supporting the Democratic version in some cases because they are worried about their own electoral fortunes, or because they actually tend to agree with the Democratic position on some of these narrow women's issues?
I think it's too hard to say. You'd have to talk to each of them individually. I think there are some aspects of the political and how do I want this to look politically, some aspects of my electoral coalition, and if I think like Susan Collins, I get support from women who support these social issues and vote for me anyway, even though I'm a Republican and they're an independent or they're a Democrat. Some of that is going on, and maybe some of their own caring more about these issues. But then you have the cases where you will have a Republican woman who can come out and say, I'm defending the party. So with the contraception, it was very interesting that Jean Shaheen on the Democratic side, who's the Democratic senator from New Hampshire, was at the forefront of pushing for contraception to be covered under the health plan. And Kelly Ayotte was one of the three main co-sponsors with Blunt of the Republican alternative amendment that wants a freedom of conscience exception. And they had her out there talking
she was at
about
every press conference.
That, yes, I'm a Republican woman. This is not a women's issue. This is about freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. So, that was their defense. And they certainly do want women to defend. When I was doing my interviewing, a lot of people don't know that on the Judiciary Committee, there's never been a Republican woman on the Judiciary Committee. So after what happens with Clarence Thomas and the hearings about sexual harassment, they want women to come on to the committee because they never want to pan an all-male panel. And so Democrats immediately put Dianne Feinstein and Carol Moseley Braun, who was a senator from Illinois, one-term senator. She actually had Barack Obama's. This is the same Barack Obama seat. But on there because they have to do something about that. Republicans have been trying to get a woman to go on there and have been unable, even when you have people like Kelly Ayotte who are attorneys and could fit fine in judiciary. They don't want to go on, and I've heard several reasons given for that.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you've heard why that is.
One reason I heard was, judiciary is not a good committee for raising money, but it's a good committee for controversial issues. Yeah. So you have to be very safe in your seat to want to be on it, and you're not going to be able to raise a lot of money from it. So when you have a very small number of Republican women, they're just not going to gravitate over there because that's just going to be problematic for them. And I would much rather be on commerce, and be able to raise money from commerce. And some people said that women haven't followed the traditional path, so fewer of them are attorneys, but that is definitely changing because Klobuchar is an attorney and Ayotte is an attorney. Feinstein is on the committee and she's not an attorney.
Right, she's a former mayor.
Right, and Grassley's the ranking member now and he's not an attorney. But but there are a lot of people with who like to talk about their prosecutorial experience. So Leahy will often talk about when he was a prosecutor, and that was a while ago because he's been in the Senate for a long time. And Lindsey Graham talks about his experience as a JAG lawyer and
well, Ted Cruz and Mike Lee and some of these guys, who have clerked for Supreme Court justices and been, lawyers and former states attorneys general, love to be on that committee too. But I wonder though, and this is just my sort of spidey sense about these kinds of things. If I was a Republican woman senator, there is no way that I would want to be on the Judiciary Committee. Why would I throw myself into the middle of human cloning, stem cell research, abortion?